champagne flutes clinked in perfect harmony as 200 guests raised their glasses to celebrate what they believed would be another year of marital bliss. But nobody in that glittering ballroom knew that the woman standing beside her husband in a stunning emerald gown had just inherited a $1.2 trillion real estate empire from a grandfather she'd never met. Ryan Mitchell adjusted his Rolex and smiled at the crowd gathered for their 5th anniversary party, but his eyes kept drifting toward the blonde woman laughing near the dessert table, his wife's best friend, Jessica Reynolds, the woman he'd been sleeping with for 8 months. His wife, Elena Foster Mitchell, squeezed his hand and whispered something about how lucky she felt. But Ryan had already made his decision, and the divorce papers sat folded in his inner jacket pocket, waiting for the perfect moment when all their friends and family could witness what he believed would be her ultimate humiliation. The inheritance notification had arrived via encrypted email just 3 hours before the party, but Elena's phone had died that morning, leaving the message unread, leaving her completely unaware that she'd just become one of the wealthiest women in North America. Ryan cleared his throat and tapped his champagne glass with a silver spoon, calling for silence, but he had no idea that the announcement he was about to make would trigger a chain of events that would destroy everything he'd built and leave him begging for mercy from the woman he was about to publicly betray. Jessica moved closer to the stage, her red dress catching the light, her smile confident, but she too remained ignorant of the fortune that had just landed in her best friend's lap, ignorant of the fact that her betrayal would cost her more than just a friendship. The room fell silent as Ryan's voice echoed through the speakers, his words about to shatter the illusion of the perfect marriage. But Elena stood there smiling, her mind on the charitable foundation she'd planned to discuss with him later, completely unaware that her husband was about to divorce her at their own anniversary party to marry her best friend, and completely unaware that what she would do next would make him regret everything. Would Ryan have proceeded with his cruel plan if he'd known about the trillion-dollar inheritance that his wife hadn't yet discovered? Would Jessica have betrayed her best friend if she'd realized that Elena was about to become more powerful than anyone in that room could imagine? Would Elena's response to this public humiliation reveal a strength that had been hidden beneath years of trying to be the perfect wife? Would the revelation of the inheritance transform Elena from a woman scorned into an unstoppable force that would dismantle everything Ryan and Jessica had schemed to build? The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, but Elena Foster Mitchell felt a strange hollowness in her chest that all the glittering lights couldn't fill. She'd spent 6 months planning this anniversary party, coordinating with caterers and florists, selecting the perfect vintage champagne. But something in Ryan's demeanor over the past few weeks had created a distance between them that she couldn't quite name. Her husband stood beside her in his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile practiced, but his eyes held a coldness that made her stomach twist with an anxiety she kept pushing down. The ballroom buzzed with conversations from their closest friends and family members, but Elena's mind drifted to the morning her phone had died, just as she was rushing out to finalize the party arrangements. She'd forgotten to charge it the night before, too exhausted from a double shift at the community center where she volunteered, too tired from the stress of trying to be everything Ryan seemed to need her to be. The device now sat in her clutch, still dead, still silent, but on its dormant screen waited a message that would change everything. An encrypted email from Rothschild and Associates, international estate attorneys, informing her that her maternal grandfather, Nathaniel Beaumont, a reclusive real estate magnate she'd never met, had passed away and named her the sole heir to his $1.2 trillion empire spanning properties across 47 countries. Elena had grown up believing her mother's family had disowned them, But the truth was more complicated. Her mother, Catherine Beaumont, had fallen in love with Elena's father, a struggling artist named David Foster, and Nathaniel had given Catherine an ultimatum: leave David or be cut off from the family fortune. Catherine had chosen love, but she died when Elena was only 7, leaving her father to raise her alone in a modest apartment in Queens. David had passed away 2 years ago, and Elena had spent those years working as a nonprofit administrator, pouring her energy into helping others, never knowing that her grandfather had been watching from afar, tracking her kindness, her integrity, her refusal to compromise her values even when money was tight. But none of that mattered now as Ryan tapped his champagne glass with a silver spoon, but the sound that rang out felt like a death knell rather than a celebration. The crowd quieted, 200 faces turning toward the stage where her husband stood, his expression unreadable. But Jessica Reynolds moved closer to the front, her red dress a slash of crimson against the cream-colored walls. Elena felt her best friend's presence before she saw her, but something about Jessica's positioning felt wrong, felt calculated, felt like a betrayal Elena's intuition had been whispering about, but her heart had refused to acknowledge. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Ryan's voice boomed through the speakers, his tone confident, almost triumphant, but Elena noticed he hadn't looked at her once since stepping up to the microphone. "5 years ago, I made what I thought was the right decision, but we all evolve, we all grow, and sometimes we realize that the path we're on isn't the one we're meant to walk." Elena's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to keep smiling, to keep standing tall in her emerald gown, even as her world began to crack beneath her feet. The guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension, sensing that something was terribly wrong, but nobody moved to intervene. Ryan's parents sat at a front table, his mother's face pale, his father's jaw clenched, but they said nothing. Elena's aunt, her father's sister, and her only remaining family stood near the bar, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "The truth is," Ryan continued, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket, "I've been unhappy for a long time, but I didn't know how to tell Elena that I'd fallen in love with someone else, someone who understands me, who challenges me, who makes me feel alive in ways I haven't felt in years." The ballroom erupted in gasps and whispered exclamations, but Elena stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Jessica stepped onto the stage, her movements fluid, practiced, rehearsed, but the smile on her face held a cruelty Elena had never seen before. They'd been best friends since college, roommates for 3 years, bridesmaids at each other's weddings. Well, Elena had been Jessica's maid of honor when Jessica married, and divorced within 18 months. But Jessica had stood beside Elena when she'd married Ryan, promising to always support her, to always protect their friendship. "I'm filing for divorce," Ryan announced, his words falling like hammers, like nails in a coffin. "And Jessica has agreed to marry me. We wanted to tell you all together, surrounded by the people who matter most, because we believe in honesty, in transparency, in living our truth." The document he held up was a divorce petition, already signed by him, waiting only for Elena's signature, but the implications went beyond just the end of their marriage. Elena's mind raced through memories, through moments she'd dismissed as paranoia, through late nights when Ryan claimed to be working but came home smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They'd been having an affair, planning this betrayal, choreographing this public humiliation while she'd been planning their anniversary celebration. But something in Elena shifted in that moment, something fundamental, something that had been dormant for too long. She thought of her mother, who'd chosen love over fortune, but who'd also taught Elena that strength meant standing up for yourself, that dignity meant never letting anyone see you break. She thought of her father, who'd worked 3 jobs to give her a good education, who died believing that kindness and integrity were worth more than wealth. but who'd also taught her that sometimes you had to fight for what you deserved. Elena stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, but her voice, when she spoke, was calm, measured, deadly quiet. You're right, Ryan. We all evolve. We all grow. And sometimes we realize that the people we trusted most were never worthy of that trust. She turned to face the crowd, but her eyes found her aunt's face, found the mixture of rage and pride there, found the strength she needed to continue. I won't sign your divorce papers tonight, Ryan, not because I want to stay married to you. That ship has sailed and good riddance to it, but because you don't get to control the narrative anymore. You don't get to turn our anniversary party into your engagement announcement. You don't get to humiliate me and walk away feeling clever. Jessica's smile faltered, but Ryan's jaw tightened, his carefully planned moment slipping away from him. Elena, don't make this harder than it has to be. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way, it's happening. The hard way, then, Elena replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. You want a divorce? Fine. But we're going to do it properly, through lawyers, through the courts, and every single asset, every single account, every single thing we've built together over these 5 years is going to be examined with a microscope. You think you're walking away clean? You think you and Jessica are riding off into the sunset while I'm left with nothing? Let me tell you something about the hard way, Ryan. It means you're going to regret every second of this betrayal. She pulled her clutch open and retrieved her dead phone, but the gesture was symbolic, powerful, a reminder that she had her own resources, her own strength. I'm leaving now. Enjoy your party. Enjoy explaining to everyone here why you thought public cruelty was an acceptable way to end a marriage. But know this, I will never, ever forgive either of you, and I will spend every ounce of energy I have making sure you both understand the consequences of your choices. Elena turned and walked toward the exit, but her aunt rushed to join her, linking arms, providing support, providing solidarity. The crowd parted before them, faces shocked, sympathetic, outraged on Elena's behalf. But she didn't acknowledge any of them. She kept her head high, her shoulders back, her spine straight. But the moment the ballroom doors closed behind her, she allowed herself one shuddering breath before steeling herself once more. Let's get your phone charged, her Aunt Margaret said, her voice tight with fury. And then let's find you the best divorce attorney in New York. That son of a bitch picked the wrong woman to humiliate. But neither of them knew, not yet, that the phone charging in Margaret's car would soon reveal a message that would transform Elena from a scorned wife into one of the most powerful women in the world. The drive to Margaret's apartment in Manhattan passed in a blur, but Elena's mind was racing, calculating, planning. Years of working in nonprofit management had taught her how to strategize, how to anticipate obstacles, how to build coalitions and leverage resources. Ryan thought she was weak, thought she was defeated, but he'd spent 5 years underestimating her, while she'd been building skills that would prove far more valuable than he could imagine. Margaret's apartment was a modest 2-bedroom in the Upper West Side, filled with family photos and comfortable furniture, but it felt like a sanctuary as Elena collapsed onto the couch. Her aunt disappeared into the kitchen to make tea, but Elena finally plugged her phone into a charger and waited for it to power on. The screen flickered to life, notifications flooding in, but one email stood out among the rest, encrypted, marked urgent from a sender she didn't recognize. Her fingers trembled as she entered the decryption password that appeared in a follow-up text message, but what she read made her world tilt on its axis. Nathaniel Beaumont, her grandfather, dead at 93, sole heir, $1.2 trillion, real estate empire, properties in 47 countries, portfolio including commercial buildings, residential developments, historical landmarks, and entire islands. Immediate transfer of assets upon identity verification and acceptance of inheritance terms. Elena read the email 3 times, but her mind refused to fully process the information. She'd grown up believing her mother's family wanted nothing to do with her, but here was evidence that her grandfather had been monitoring her life, had been impressed by her choices, had decided she was worthy of an inheritance that would make her one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet. The email included a phone number for the estate attorneys and instructions to call within 72 hours to begin the transfer process. "Margaret," Elena called out, her voice shaking, "you need to see this." Her aunt rushed back into the room, but the tea was forgotten as Elena handed her the phone. Margaret's eyes widened as she scrolled through the message, her face cycling through disbelief, shock, and finally fierce joy. Oh my God, Elena, do you know what this means?" "It means everything changes," Elena whispered, but her mind was already spinning with possibilities. "It means Ryan just divorced one of the wealthiest women in North America at our anniversary party to marry my backstabbing best friend. It means they have no idea what's coming for them." But revenge, Elena knew, wasn't about lashing out impulsively. It was about calculated justice. She thought back to her nonprofit work, to the organizations she'd helped build, to the communities she'd served. But now she had the resources to make a real difference, to create lasting change. And yes, to make Ryan and Jessica understand the magnitude of their mistake. The next morning, Elena sat in the conference room of Rothschild and Associates, but the mahogany table and leather chairs felt surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's life. Marcus Rothschild, no relation to the famous banking family, he'd explained, with a wry smile, was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes. He'd spent 3 hours walking Elena through her grandfather's estate, but the numbers were so large they'd lost meaning somewhere around the 100 billion mark. "Your grandfather was a complicated man," Marcus explained, spreading documents across the table, "but he respected your mother's choice, even if he couldn't accept it at the time. He spent the last 30 years building this empire with you in mind, structuring it so that you'd have the resources to make whatever impact you wanted on the world. He saw how you lived, how you dedicated yourself to helping others despite having so little yourself. And he believed you'd be a better steward of this wealth than anyone else in the family." Elena learned that Nathaniel had cut off her mother's siblings, 2 uncles who'd squandered their trust funds on yachts and gambling. But he'd never stopped thinking about Catherine, never stopped regretting the ultimatum that drove her away. When Catherine died, he'd watched Elena from afar, hiring private investigators to monitor her well-being, making anonymous donations to her schools and later to the nonprofits where she worked, but always maintaining distance, always respecting Catherine's choice to leave the family behind. "He wanted you to have everything he couldn't give your mother," Marcus continued, "but he also wanted to make sure you were ready. The inheritance comes with certain conditions. You must maintain the charitable foundations he established. You must keep the estate intact for at least 5 years before making any major sales, and you must use a portion of the income to continue your community work. Can you accept those terms?" "Yes," Elena said without hesitation, but her mind was already racing ahead to what came next. "But I need your help with something else. My soon-to-be ex-husband filed for divorce yesterday, and I want to make sure he doesn't get a penny of this inheritance. What are my options?" Marcus's smile was sharp, knowing, approving. "Oh, I think we can arrange something very interesting indeed. Tell me everything about your marriage, the timeline of events, and what you know about his affair." Over the next 4 hours, Elena detailed every moment of her relationship with Ryan, but Marcus and his team took careful notes, building a legal strategy that would protect her newfound wealth while ensuring that Ryan's betrayal was properly addressed. They discovered that Ryan had been moving money from their joint accounts into secret accounts he'd opened with Jessica, that he'd been planning the divorce for at least 6 months, that he'd deliberately timed the announcement for maximum humiliation. "This is textbook marital misconduct," Marcus noted, his tone satisfied. In New York, adultery isn't grounds for financial penalty in divorce anymore, but the asset concealment and the timing of his filing, deliberately trying to hurt and humiliate you, give us significant leverage. Plus, the inheritance came to you before he filed the papers, which means it's technically a marital asset, but we can argue that it's a family inheritance that should be excluded from division. With the right judge, the right arguments, we can make sure Ryan gets exactly what he deserves, which is nothing. But Elena had already moved beyond just protecting her assets, her mind working through a larger plan. "I want to buy his company," she said suddenly, the idea crystallizing as she spoke. "Ryan owns a commercial real estate development firm. It's been struggling lately, but he's too proud to admit it. I want to acquire it, restructure it, and make sure he has to watch everything he built become part of my empire." Marcus's eyebrows rose, but respect flickered in his eyes. "Aggressive. I like it. Let me make some calls. If his company is as vulnerable as you suggest, we can probably arrange a hostile takeover within a few weeks. But Elena, are you sure you want to go this route? Revenge can be satisfying in the moment, but it can also consume you." "This isn't revenge," Elena corrected, her voice firm. "This is justice. This is showing Ryan and Jessica that actions have consequences, that you can't destroy someone and expect to walk away unscathed. And more than that, it's about building something meaningful with these resources. I'm going to transform my grandfather's empire into a force for good, but I'm also going to make sure that the people who tried to crush me understand exactly who they were dealing with." The news of Elena's inheritance remained secret for exactly 2 weeks, but during that time she moved through the world like a ghost, quietly restructuring her life, quietly building her power base. Ryan had been calling and texting constantly, demanding she sign the divorce papers, threatening legal action, but Elena's new attorneys sent him carefully worded responses that gave nothing away while keeping him off balance. Jessica had tried to reach out too, but Elena blocked her number after receiving a single text that said, "I'm sorry it happened this way, but Ryan and I deserve to be happy." The audacity of that message had made Elena's blood boil, but she channeled her rage into action. She met with business advisors, restructured the charitable foundations, began identifying properties in the portfolio that could be converted into affordable housing, started planning community centers and schools in underserved neighborhoods. The work gave her purpose, gave her direction, but it also revealed just how much power she now wielded. The transformation became public on a Thursday morning when the Wall Street Journal published a front-page article titled, "Mystery Heiress Inherits Trillion-Dollar Real Estate Empire." The story detailed Nathaniel Beaumont's death and the shocking revelation that his sole heir was a non-profit worker from Queens who'd been living in a rent-controlled apartment despite being one of the wealthiest women in the world. The article included Elena's photo, a professional headshot she'd done for the estate announcement, but it also mentioned that she was currently in the process of divorcing her husband of 5 years. Ryan's phone started ringing at 6:47 a.m., but he was still in bed with Jessica when the first call came through. His business partner, David Chen, was nearly screaming into the phone. "Tell me it's not true. Tell me your wife isn't the Beaumont heiress. Tell me you didn't file for divorce from a woman worth over $1 trillion. But Ryan had already pulled up the article on his tablet, his face draining of color as he read, his hands beginning to shake. Jessica leaned over his shoulder, but her expression shifted from confusion to horror as she processed the implications. They'd betrayed, humiliated, and divorced one of the wealthiest women in North America, but neither of them had known. Neither of them had suspected. Neither of them had imagined that the quiet, kind woman they'd dismissed as weak was actually an heiress to an empire that dwarfed anything they could have dreamed. No, Ryan whispered, scrolling through the article again, hoping he'd misread, hoping this was a nightmare. No, she didn't know. Her phone was dead. She couldn't have known when I filed. But the article answered that question too, noting that Elena had learned of her inheritance the same evening as her anniversary party, just hours after her husband had publicly announced their divorce. The timeline was clear, the implications devastating. Ryan had divorced Elena before she officially accepted the inheritance, which meant he'd forfeited any claim to the assets. But he'd also done it in the most publicly humiliating way possible, which meant Elena had every reason to destroy him. Jessica's phone buzzed with notifications, but every message was from friends and family expressing shock, dismay, and in some cases, barely concealed glee at her predicament. Her mother's text was particularly brutal. "You betrayed your best friend for a man who was married to a trillion-dollar heiress. I raised you better than this. Don't come to Sunday dinner until you've figured out how to apologize for the rest of your life." But apologies wouldn't matter now, wouldn't change the fundamental reality of what they'd done. Ryan stumbled out of bed and paced the apartment, his mind racing through the implications for his business, his reputation, his future. His company was already struggling, overextended on several development projects, but now the news that he'd divorced the Beaumont heiress would make him a laughingstock in business circles, would make investors wary, would make lenders nervous. The first domino fell 3 days later when Ryan's largest investor, a private equity firm that had backed his last 2 projects, announced they were pulling their funding. The official reason was strategic realignment, but the real message was clear. Nobody wanted to be associated with a man who'd humiliated and betrayed one of the most powerful women in the world. The second domino fell a week after that, when 2 major clients canceled contracts, citing concerns about leadership and judgment. But Ryan still didn't know the worst of it, still didn't know that Elena had been quietly buying up his company's debt, acquiring stakes from investors who were eager to distance themselves from the scandal. The hostile takeover happened on a Monday morning when Ryan arrived at his office to find a team of attorneys waiting for him. But Marcus Rothschild was leading them, his smile pleasant but his eyes cold. "Mr. Mitchell," Marcus said, extending a hand that Ryan didn't shake, "I'm here on behalf of my client, Elena Foster, formerly Elena Foster Mitchell. As of this morning, she owns 73% of your company's outstanding shares and controls 85% of your corporate debt. She's invoking the change of control provisions in your operating agreement and assuming the role of majority owner. Your employment is terminated effective immediately, and you have 1 hour to clear out your personal belongings." Ryan felt the floor drop out from under him, but his pride wouldn't let him show weakness. "She can't do this. I built this company from nothing. This is my life's work." "Actually," Marcus replied, his tone almost bored, "she can and she has. You signed very standard operating agreements when you took on investors, agreements that allow for exactly this scenario. Ms. Foster has already selected new leadership for the company, people with integrity, people who understand that success isn't built on betrayal, and they'll be transforming this organization into something much better than what you created." Jessica was waiting outside the building when Ryan emerged an hour later, but his box of personal items felt like a monument to his failure. She tried to take his arm, but he shook her off, his anger and humiliation needing a target. "This is your fault," he snapped, ignoring the unfairness of the statement. "If you hadn't pushed me to make the announcement at the party, if you'd just let me do it quietly, maybe none of this would have happened." But Jessica's patience was wearing thin too, her own world crumbling as friends abandoned her, as job opportunities evaporated, as her reputation became synonymous with betrayal. "My fault? You're the one who wanted to humiliate her in front of everyone. You're the one who thought it would be powerful to divorce your wife at your anniversary party. I just went along with it because I thought you knew what you were doing." Their relationship, built on deception and stolen moments, couldn't survive the pressure of consequences, couldn't withstand the harsh light of public judgment. They fought constantly over the next month, each blaming the other for their predicament. But eventually Jessica moved out, leaving Ryan alone in an apartment he could no longer afford, facing a future that looked increasingly bleak. Meanwhile, Elena had become a media sensation, but she handled her newfound fame with the same grace and intelligence she'd brought to her nonprofit work. She gave carefully selected interviews discussing her plans to use her inheritance to address housing inequality, to fund education initiatives, to support community development in underserved neighborhoods. She spoke about her grandfather's legacy and her mother's choice, weaving a narrative that was both inspiring and authentic. But she also didn't hide from the scandal of her divorce, addressing it directly in an interview with CBS News. "My ex-husband chose to divorce me in the most publicly humiliating way possible," she said, her voice steady, her gaze direct. "He did it believing I was powerless, believing I would be crushed by the experience. What he didn't understand is that my power never came from money or status. It came from my values, my integrity, my commitment to doing right by others. The inheritance didn't change who I am. It just gave me more resources to do the work I've always wanted to do." When the interviewer asked if she felt any satisfaction in Ryan's downfall, Elena paused, considering her words carefully. "I feel sad that it came to this. I feel sad that someone I loved was capable of such cruelty. But do I regret holding him accountable for his choices? Not for a second. Actions have consequences, and people who build their happiness on someone else's pain need to understand that the universe has a way of balancing the scales." The interview went viral, but Elena's combination of vulnerability and strength resonated with millions of people who'd experienced betrayal, who'd been underestimated, who'd fought to maintain their dignity in the face of humiliation. She became a symbol of resilience, but more importantly, she became a model for how to transform pain into purpose. 6 months after the anniversary party, Elena stood in front of a newly constructed community center in Queens, but the building bore her mother's name, the Catherine Beaumont Foster Center for Community Development. The facility included a library, computer labs, job training programs, child care services, and affordable housing units on the upper floors. It was the first of 50 such centers Elena planned to build across the country, but it was also a tribute to the woman who'd chosen love over fortune and taught her daughter that true wealth came from how you treated others. Ryan attended the opening, but he stood at the back of the crowd, unnoticed, unemployed, diminished. He watched Elena cut the ribbon, watched her speak about second chances and community resilience, watched her shine with a confidence he'd never seen during their marriage. Jessica wasn't with him. She'd moved to Los Angeles 6 weeks earlier, trying to outrun her reputation, but her absence felt appropriate somehow, felt like another consequence of their betrayal. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Elena spotted Ryan, but instead of looking away, she walked directly toward him. Her security team tensed, but she waved them off, approaching her ex-husband with the same calm determination she'd shown on their anniversary night. "Ryan," she said, her tone neutral, professional, but not unkind. "Elena," he replied, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. "The center looks incredible. Your mother would be proud." "Yes," Elena agreed, "she would be, but she'd also be disappointed in what you did, in how you chose to end our marriage. You know that, right?" Ryan nodded, unable to meet her eyes, but the weight of his regret was visible in every line of his body. "I know. I think about it every day. If I could go back, if I could do it differently." "But you can't," Elena interrupted, her voice firm but not cruel. You made your choice, Ryan. You chose humiliation over honesty, cruelty over kindness, and betrayal over integrity. Those choices have consequences, and you're living with them now. I don't say that to hurt you. I say it because it's the truth, and I think you need to hear it. I've lost everything, Ryan admitted, his voice breaking slightly. My company, my reputation, my relationship with Jessica. Everything I thought mattered is gone, and I have no one to blame but myself. Elena studied him for a long moment, but then she surprised him. You haven't lost everything, Ryan. You've lost the things you built on a foundation of deception, but you still have your life, your health, your ability to make different choices going forward. What you do with that second chance is up to you. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, but it wasn't for one of her companies. It was for a counseling center she'd funded. This is a resource for people working through relationship trauma, addiction, and personal crisis. I think you should call them. Not because I want anything from you, but because I genuinely believe everyone deserves a chance to heal and grow, even people who've hurt others. Ryan took the card, but his hands were shaking, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Why would you help me after everything I did? Because, Elena said, her voice softening slightly, holding on to anger and resentment doesn't hurt you. It hurts me. And I refuse to let your betrayal turn me into a bitter person. I'm moving forward with my life, building something meaningful, but I can do that while still acknowledging your humanity. Just don't mistake my kindness for weakness, Ryan. If you ever try to hurt me again, if you ever come after me or my organizations, there won't be a second act of grace. With that, she turned and walked away. But Ryan stood there, clutching the business card, understanding for the first time the magnitude of what he'd lost. Elena wasn't just wealthy. She was strong, compassionate, visionary, everything he'd been too blind to appreciate when they were married. His public humiliation of her hadn't broken her. It had revealed her true character, forcing her to rise to a challenge she might never have faced otherwise. Over the following years, Elena's empire grew, but not in the traditional sense of accumulating more wealth for its own sake. She transformed properties into affordable housing, converted abandoned buildings into community centers, funded scholarships for students from low-income backgrounds, but she also maintained her grandfather's charitable foundations, expanding their reach and impact. She became known as a different kind of billionaire, someone who understood that extreme wealth came with extreme responsibility. Ryan eventually took her advice and sought counseling, but the process of confronting his choices, his insecurities, his need to feel powerful by diminishing others was brutal and humbling. He found work eventually, but not in real estate. He became a consultant helping people rebuild after financial crises, using his own spectacular failure as a case study in the consequences of poor judgment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild something resembling integrity. Jessica never returned to New York, but she sent Elena a letter 2 years after the anniversary party. It was 15 pages long, filled with apologies, explanations, and attempts to justify the unjustifiable. But the final paragraph contained a sentence that felt genuine. I lost my best friend because I confused love with validation, because I thought taking something from you would fill the emptiness I felt inside. I was wrong about everything, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting it. Elena read the letter once, but she filed it away without responding. Some betrayals were too fundamental to forgive, some friendships too thoroughly destroyed to rebuild, but she could acknowledge Jessica's pain without accepting her back into her life. The grace Elena extended to Ryan at the community center opening was about her own healing, not about absolving anyone else's guilt. 5 years after inheriting her grandfather's fortune, Elena stood in the penthouse office of her headquarters building overlooking Central Park, but she felt the ghost of her mother's presence, felt the weight of choices made decades ago that had led to this moment. Catherine had chosen love over money, but Elena had been given both. Not because she'd sought wealth, but because she'd lived according to values that her grandfather had finally recognized and respected. The divorce from Ryan had been finalized 3 years earlier, but Elena barely thought about him anymore. She'd moved on completely, focusing her energy on the massive undertaking of transforming a trillion-dollar empire into a force for social change. There were setbacks and challenges, people who questioned her methods, critics who accused her of being naive, but she persisted, driven by a vision that transcended personal enrichment. Her phone buzzed with a notification, but the message was from Marcus Rothschild, now one of her most trusted advisors. "Board meeting tomorrow at 10. We need to discuss the Global Housing Initiative expansion. Also, there's someone here to see you. Says it's important." Elena frowned, but told him to send the visitor up. She wasn't expecting anyone, but her security team had cleared whoever it was, so she waited by the window, watching the sun set over Manhattan, thinking about how much had changed since that terrible anniversary night. The elevator doors opened, but Elena turned to see a young woman stepping out, her face vaguely familiar, her eyes uncertain. It took Elena a moment to place her, but then recognition clicked. This was Ryan's younger sister, Melissa, whom she'd always liked during the marriage, but had lost touch with after the divorce. "Melissa," Elena said, gesturing to the seating area by the window. "This is a surprise. How have you been?" Melissa sat down carefully, but her expression was troubled, nervous, clearly building up to something difficult. "I've been okay, but I'm not here about me. I'm here about Ryan. He's in the hospital, Elena. He had a heart attack last week, and the doctors say he's going to survive. But it was serious. He asked me to tell you, but he doesn't want anything from you. He just wanted you to know." Elena felt a complicated mix of emotions, but she settled on concern rather than satisfaction. "I'm sorry to hear that. How old is Ryan? He's only 33. That's too young for a heart attack." "The doctors say it was stress-related," Melissa explained, her voice soft. "He's been working himself to exhaustion, trying to rebuild what he lost, trying to prove something to himself, or to you, or to the world. He won't slow down, won't take care of himself, but now his body has forced the issue." "I appreciate you telling me," Elena said, meaning it. "Is there anything he needs? Hospital bills covered? I can arrange—" "No," Melissa interrupted gently. "He was very specific about that. He doesn't want your money or your help. He just wanted you to know, because despite everything, you were important to him once, and he thinks you should be informed." Elena nodded, but she felt the weight of complicated history pressing down on her. "Tell him I hope he recovers fully. Tell him I mean that sincerely. And tell him that sometimes the universe sends us wake-up calls, and the smart thing is to listen." After Melissa left, Elena stood at the window for a long time, but her mind was processing the news, integrating it into her understanding of consequences and redemption. Ryan's heart attack wasn't divine punishment or karmic justice. It was the predictable result of a man driving himself too hard, unable to forgive himself, unable to accept that his past mistakes didn't have to define his entire future. She picked up her phone and called Marcus, but when he answered, she had a request that surprised even herself. "I want to fund a series of wellness centers focused on men's health, particularly stress management and cardiovascular disease prevention. Name one after my father. He died of a heart attack too, working himself to death trying to provide for me. But make sure the centers are accessible to everyone, regardless of ability to pay." "That's a beautiful idea," Marcus said warmly. "Are you thinking about Ryan?" "I'm thinking about everyone who carries so much weight they can't breathe," Elena replied. "I'm thinking about how many people destroy themselves because they can't forgive their own mistakes, can't imagine a path forward after failure. I want to create spaces where people can heal, where they can learn to be kinder to themselves. The wellness centers opened 18 months later, but they represented Elena's evolving understanding of what it meant to use power responsibly. She wasn't just building physical infrastructure. She was trying to address the deeper issues that caused suffering, that trapped people in cycles of self-destruction, that prevented healing and growth. Ryan never contacted her directly, but she heard through Melissa that he'd spent 6 months at one of the wellness centers, learning stress management techniques, processing his guilt and shame through therapy, beginning to accept that his worst moment didn't have to be his defining moment. He eventually resumed his consulting work, but he did it differently, prioritizing his health and well-being, setting boundaries, refusing to repeat the patterns that had nearly killed him. Jessica remained in Los Angeles, but Elena occasionally saw her name in connection with a nonprofit focused on helping women rebuild after betrayal and relationship trauma. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. Jessica was trying to help others avoid the mistakes she'd made, but she didn't reach out, didn't comment, simply noted that everyone was finding their own path toward redemption, or at least toward meaning. 10 years after that devastating anniversary party, Elena married again, but this time to someone who'd known her both before and after the inheritance, someone who'd seen her at her lowest and her highest, someone who loved her for her character rather than her wealth. His name was James Torres, a community organizer she'd met while building one of her centers, and their wedding was a small private ceremony attended only by close friends and family. No spectacle, no performance, just genuine love and commitment. They honeymooned at one of her properties, a restored historical estate in the south of France that she'd converted into a retreat center for artists and writers. But even on vacation, Elena couldn't completely step away from her work. She spent mornings on conference calls and reviewing plans, but James didn't mind. He understood that her commitment to making a difference wasn't something she could turn off. It was fundamental to who she was. One afternoon, as they walked through the estate's gardens, James asked a question that had been on his mind. "Do you ever think about Ryan, about what happened?" Elena considered the question carefully, but her answer came easily. "Sometimes. Usually when I'm making decisions about the organization, wondering if I'm being too aggressive or too forgiving, trying to find the balance between justice and mercy. What Ryan did taught me things about myself I might never have learned otherwise. My capacity for strength, my ability to transform pain into purpose, my understanding that power means nothing if it's not used to lift others up." "Do you think he regrets it?" James asked. "I know he does," Elena replied. "But the more important question is whether he learned from it, whether he became a better person because of the consequences he faced. And from what Melissa tells me, the answer is yes. He's not the man he was 10 years ago, and that's what matters." James pulled her close, but his voice was warm with affection when he spoke. "That's what I love about you. You can hold people accountable without destroying them. You can pursue justice without becoming cruel. You're proof that having power doesn't mean you have to abuse it." Elena smiled, but she thought about her grandfather, about the empire he'd built, about the choice he'd made to leave it all to a granddaughter he'd never met, betting that she would use it wisely. "I hope I'm living up to his expectations. I hope my mother would be proud of who I've become." "They would be," James assured her. "You're exactly the person they hoped you'd be, strong, kind, principled, but also realistic about human nature and willing to make hard choices when necessary. The world needs more people like you." 20 years after the anniversary party, Elena's organizations had transformed millions of lives, but she'd also transformed herself, evolving from a woman who'd been publicly humiliated into a global leader whose name was synonymous with ethical wealth management and social responsibility. She'd written 2 books about her journey, but she'd donated all the proceeds to her foundations, refusing to profit from telling her story. Ryan had reached out once during those 2 decades, but it was a brief email thanking her for the wellness center that had saved his life, acknowledging that he'd been given grace he didn't deserve, but expressing hope that he was using his second chance well. Elena had responded warmly but briefly, wishing him well, but maintaining appropriate boundaries. Some chapters needed to stay closed, even when forgiveness had been granted. Jessica had never reached out at all, but Elena heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd built a meaningful life in Los Angeles, that she'd married someone who genuinely loved her, that she'd spent years in therapy processing her choices. Elena felt genuinely glad for her, but she also knew they would never be friends again, never rebuild what had been destroyed. Some betrayals left scars that time couldn't fully heal. On the 20th anniversary of that terrible night, Elena returned to the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, but this time she was there to receive a humanitarian award from an international development organization. The irony of the location wasn't lost on her, but she'd chosen it deliberately, wanting to reclaim the space where she'd been publicly humiliated, wanting to transform it from a site of pain into a site of triumph. As she stood at the podium accepting the award, Elena looked out at the crowd and saw faces young and old, people whose lives had been touched by her work, communities that had been transformed by her investments. But she also saw ghosts, the ghost of the woman she'd been 20 years ago, standing beside a husband who was about to betray her, completely unaware of the fortune she'd inherited, completely unprepared for the journey ahead. 20 years ago, Elena said, her voice carrying through the ballroom, I stood in this room and experienced one of the worst moments of my life. My husband divorced me at our anniversary party, publicly humiliating me in front of everyone I knew. That same night, I learned that I'd inherited a massive fortune from a grandfather I'd never met. But that inheritance came with a challenge. Could I use power wisely? Could I transform pain into purpose? Could I prove that wealth was meant to serve humanity rather than dominate it? The room was silent, but every eye was fixed on Elena as she continued. The answer to those questions is what we're celebrating tonight. Not my individual accomplishments, but the collective work of thousands of people who've dedicated themselves to building a more just, more equitable world. The man who betrayed me thought he was destroying me, but what he actually did was force me to discover strengths I didn't know I had. And in a strange way, I'm grateful for that, because without that terrible night, I might never have become the person I needed to be. She paused, but her eyes found Melissa in the crowd. Ryan's sister had become one of her foundation directors, bridging the gap between past and present, and she smiled. We all face moments when we're tested, when we have to decide who we want to be in the face of cruelty or injustice. My hope is that the work we've done together shows that choosing grace over vengeance, justice over revenge, and purpose over bitterness can create something beautiful and lasting. Thank you for being part of this journey. The applause was thunderous, but Elena felt a sense of peace settling over her, a recognition that she'd completed a circle, that she'd transformed that ballroom from a place of humiliation into a place of celebration. As she left the stage, she received countless congratulations, but her mind was already moving forward, planning the next center, the next initiative, the next way to use her resources to make the world better. That night, lying in bed beside James in their Manhattan townhouse, Elena reflected on the strange path her life had taken, but she felt grateful for all of it, the pain, the triumph, the inheritance, the work. Ryan had tried to destroy her, but instead, he'd inadvertently launched her into a destiny she might never have claimed otherwise. In trying to diminish her, he'd actually revealed just how powerful she truly was. Do you think he knows? James asked sleepily, somehow following her train of thought. Do you think Ryan understands that he gave you the greatest gift by showing you who you really were? I don't know, Elena admitted, but I hope so. I hope he's found peace with what happened, just like I have. Not because he deserves forgiveness. None of us deserve grace, we receive it anyway, but because everyone deserves the chance to become better than their worst moment. That's very generous of you, James murmured. It's not generous, Elena corrected gently. It's practical. Holding on to anger would diminish me, would limit what I could accomplish, would poison the work I'm trying to do. So I chose to let it go, but not to let it be forgotten. What Ryan did mattered. It taught me important lessons. But it doesn't define either of us anymore. We've both moved on, both built new lives, both become different people. The city lights filtered through their windows, but Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the day lifting, feeling gratitude for the journey she'd traveled. She'd started as a nonprofit worker living in a modest apartment, completely unaware that she was about to inherit a trillion-dollar empire, completely unprepared for her husband's betrayal. But she'd survived it all and emerged stronger, wiser, more committed to using power for good. In the end, Ryan's attempt to humiliate her had backfired spectacularly, but not because she'd crushed him, though she could have, but because she'd proven that real power came from how you treated others, from the values you upheld, from the impact you made on the world. He'd divorced a woman he thought was powerless, but he'd actually divorced one of the most powerful women in the world, someone who would use that power to transform millions of lives, someone who would never forget where she came from or the lessons she'd learned along the way. And that, Elena knew, was the real triumph. Not the wealth, not the revenge, not even the public vindication, but the knowledge that she'd remained true to herself despite everything, that she'd chosen grace and justice over cruelty, that she'd built something meaningful from the ashes of her humiliation. Ryan would have to live with his regrets for the rest of his life, but Elena could sleep peacefully, knowing she'd honored her mother's memory, her father's values, and her grandfather's faith in her. The story of that anniversary party would be told and retold, but Elena didn't mind. It had become a modern parable about the consequences of betrayal, the power of resilience, the importance of character, but it was also a reminder that none of us truly knows what another person is capable of until we push them to their limits. Ryan had pushed Elena to her breaking point, but instead of breaking, she'd transformed, had risen to meet challenges she never would have faced otherwise, had become a force for change that would outlast any individual lifetime. And in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of all she'd built and all she'd become, Elena Foster, no longer Mitchell, never again anyone's property or anyone's victim, smiled and drifted toward sleep, dreaming of the communities she would help build tomorrow, the lives she would touch, the legacy she would leave behind. The inheritance had given her resources, but her own strength and character had shown her how to use them, and that made all the difference. The infertile wife he divorced stood in the shadows of his celebration, watching him toast his pregnant mistress with champagne he couldn't afford. But what he didn't know was that the woman he'd abandoned owned the very hospital where his mother now fought for her life, on machines he assumed were covered by insurance. She was no ordinary discarded spouse, but a legendary medical tycoon who'd built an empire while he'd been too blind to see past her empty womb. And now his mother's survival depended on the mercy of the woman he'd thrown away like garbage. He'd chosen fertility over fortune, but the mistress carrying his child knew nothing of the debt collectors circling his failing business, while his ex-wife held both his mother's medical files and the mortgage to his company in her perfectly manicured hands. The hospital hummed with her authority as she reviewed his mother's critical condition. But revenge wasn't just about denying care. It was about letting him discover, piece by devastating piece, that the barren woman he'd mocked was actually the silent partner who'd funded his entire career. And now she was ready to collect. Would his pregnant mistress stand by him when the bankruptcy notices arrived? Would his mother survive long enough to learn her son had destroyed the one woman who could save her? And would he finally understand that infertility was never the weakness? His greed, his betrayal, and his devastating blindness were. The divorce papers had been signed on a Tuesday, but David Mitchell remembered it as the day he'd finally chosen his future over his past. His wife of 7 years had sat across from him in the lawyer's office with dry eyes and a calm expression that had unsettled him more than tears would have. But he'd pushed that discomfort aside because Jessica was 4 months pregnant and glowing with the promise he'd always wanted. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd stopped paying attention years ago, was that the woman signing those papers controlled 43% of Mitchell Medical Supplies, the company his grandfather had founded, and that he now ran into the ground with quarterly losses he blamed on market conditions. She'd bought those shares through shell companies while he'd been busy explaining to friends that his wife's inability to conceive was destroying their marriage. But Emma Hartley had learned long ago that men like David only saw what they wanted to see. 6 months after the divorce, David stood in St. Augustine Memorial Hospital's intensive care unit, watching his mother struggle for each breath through a ventilator. Margaret Mitchell had collapsed at her garden club meeting, but the stroke had been massive and the prognosis grim. The neurologist had used words like minimal brain activity and quality of life decisions, but David had insisted on every possible intervention because that's what sons did. They fought for their mothers even when the bills were piling up like snow in a blizzard. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to discuss your account balance," the hospital administrator said, appearing at his elbow with a tablet that glowed with numbers David didn't want to see. "Your mother's care has exceeded your insurance coverage, and we require payment arrangements for continued treatment." David's jaw tightened because Jessica was at home with their newborn daughter, and his company had just lost its biggest supplier contract. But he couldn't let his mother die over money. "I'll figure it out," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. The administrator nodded with professional sympathy, but his eyes held something else, a knowing quality that made David's skin prickle. "The hospital board will be reviewing high-balance cases next week. I'd recommend securing payment before then." What David didn't understand was that the hospital board had only one person who mattered, and she'd been waiting for this moment since the day he'd told her that a real woman would have given me children by now. The story of Emma Hartley's rise was one David had never bothered to learn, but it had begun long before their marriage in the research labs of Johns Hopkins, where she'd developed a revolutionary drug delivery system at 23. She'd been a prodigy who saw patterns in molecular structures the way musicians heard symphonies in silence. But her professors had warned her that brilliance without connections would only take her so far in the pharmaceutical world. She'd met David at a medical supply conference where his family's company was exhibiting outdated equipment with impressive marketing. But his charm had been undeniable, the way he'd listened to her ideas about improving surgical tools, the way he'd made her feel seen in a world that often overlooked women in science. They'd married after a whirlwind courtship, but the romance had curdled the moment her first pregnancy test came back negative, then the second, then the 20th. "My mother wants grandchildren," David had said after year 3, as if Emma's body was a malfunctioning appliance. "Maybe we should see a specialist." They'd seen 17 specialists, but the diagnosis had always been the same. Unexplained infertility, a medical mystery that Emma's brilliant mind couldn't solve for herself. David's resentment had grown with each failed cycle, but Emma had poured her grief into her work, patenting 3 more medical devices and licensing them through companies David never connected to his wife because she'd used her maiden name professionally. When Jessica had appeared at Mitchell Medical Supplies as a sales representative with red hair and easy laughter, Emma had seen the end coming like a diagnosis written in bold print. David's late nights at the office had multiplied, but his company's numbers had continued to decline because he'd been too distracted to notice that his new sales rep was selling nothing while costing him everything. "I'm in love with someone else," David had finally admitted, but his eyes had been defiant rather than apologetic. "Jessica's pregnant. She's giving me what you never could." Emma had felt something break inside her that wasn't her heart, but rather the last thread of mercy she'd been holding for the man she'd once believed she loved. "I hope you'll be very happy," she'd said, and she'd meant it the way a surgeon means, "This won't hurt." A comforting lie before the cutting begins. The shell companies had been easy to establish for someone with Emma's resources and intelligence, but taking control of St. Augustine Memorial had required 3 years of strategic stock purchases and board manipulation. She'd become the hospital's primary shareholder, while David had been busy playing house with Jessica and their baby. But Emma had been patient because revenge rushed was revenge wasted. "Dr. Hartley, the Mitchell file is ready for your review," her assistant said, placing a thick folder on the desk of Emma's executive office, the one on the hospital's top floor that David had walked past dozens of times without realizing who occupied it. Emma opened the file with steady hands, though her pulse quickened as she saw Margaret Mitchell's deteriorating brain scans. The older woman had been kind to her once, before David had poisoned that relationship with stories about Emma's deficiencies, but kindness didn't erase the countless family dinners where Margaret had asked pointed questions about grandchildren and sighed dramatically about her friend's lucky daughters-in-law. "The account is $473,000 in arrears," the assistant continued, "and Mr. Mitchell's company just had its credit line revoked by First National." Emma had arranged that revocation through a carefully placed phone call to a bank executive who owed her a favor, but she kept her expression neutral. "And the medical prognosis? Without continued intensive support, Mrs. Mitchell has approximately 72 hours. With support, she could linger for months, but meaningful recovery is unlikely." The decision Emma faced wasn't about mercy or cruelty, but about the message she wanted to send to the man who'd reduced her worth to her reproductive system. She'd built an empire while he'd built nothing, but he'd thrown her away for a woman whose only apparent talent was getting pregnant, and now that empire could save or destroy him. "Schedule a meeting with Mr. Mitchell," Emma said quietly, closing the file. "It's time we discussed his mother's care options." David had expected to meet with a hospital administrator, or perhaps a finance manager, but the assistant who led him to the executive floor seemed too well dressed and the elevator too private. The office he entered was more penthouse than workplace, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and artwork that probably cost more than his house. The woman behind the desk had her back to him, studying the skyline with a posture he recognized even after 2 years. But his brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing because Emma was supposed to be alone in some apartment, childless and forgotten. Not here in this tower of power and money. "Hello, David," Emma said, turning to face him with a smile that held no warmth. "I understand you're having difficulty with your mother's hospital bills." The floor seemed to tilt beneath David's feet because this couldn't be happening, but the nameplate on the desk read, "Dr. Emma Hartley, Chief Executive Officer," and the degrees on the wall were from institutions that didn't hand out credentials to anyone ordinary. You work here?" "I own here," Emma corrected, moving to sit behind her desk with the confidence of someone who'd earned every inch of her authority. St. Augustine Memorial is my hospital, David, one of 17 healthcare facilities I control across 6 states. The words hit him like physical blows, but David's mind was racing backward through their marriage, trying to understand how he'd missed this. "You never said—" "You never asked," Emma interrupted, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "You were too busy complaining about my empty womb to notice that my patents were generating $30 million annually, or that I'd been anonymously funding your failing company for the last 5 years of our marriage." David's vision blurred because this had to be a nightmare, but Emma was pulling up documents on her computer screen, spreadsheets showing cash infusions into Mitchell Medical Supplies, all traced back to companies he now recognized as her shell corporations. She'd been saving him while he'd been betraying her, but that realization came with a horror that made him physically ill. "Why?" he managed to ask, though he wasn't sure if he meant why had she helped him, or why was she telling him now. "Because I loved you once," Emma said simply. "But that was before you decided my value as a woman was determined by my fertility rather than my mind, my work, or my devotion to a man who didn't deserve any of it." The cruelty of her words was matched only by their truth, but David's panic was rising because his mother was dying 3 floors below them, and this woman, his ex-wife, held all the power. "Emma, please, my mother needs—" "Your mother needs 24-hour intensive care that costs approximately $8,000 per day," Emma recited, pulling up another file. "Your insurance covered the first 100,000, but you're now approaching $500,000 in debt, and your company can't cover it because I've been systematically dismantling your supply contracts for the past 6 months." The confession should have shocked him, but David was beyond shock, drowning in the revelation of exactly how blind and stupid he'd been. "You're killing my business?" "Your business was already dying," Emma corrected. "I was just the one who stopped resuscitating it with anonymous loans and supplier connections. Mitchell Medical Supplies has been insolvent for 3 years, David. But you were too busy impregnating your mistress to notice that I was the only thing keeping you afloat." The flashback hit David with the force of a semi-truck, a memory he'd suppressed of Emma working late in their home office, her desk covered with files and contracts he'd never questioned. She'd told him once that she did consulting work, but he'd been watching a baseball game and hadn't cared enough to ask what kind of consulting or for whom. "You have a choice," Emma was saying, pulling him back to the present moment that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. "You can continue your mother's care, but it will require you to sign over full ownership of Mitchell Medical Supplies to one of my acquisition companies. The transfer will clear her hospital debt, and I'll ensure she receives the best possible comfort care for her remaining time." David's throat felt like sandpaper because she was offering him a devil's bargain, his mother's final dignity in exchange for his family's legacy. "And if I refuse? Then your mother will be transferred to county care in 72 hours, and your company will be liquidated by creditors within the month anyway," Emma said, with the clinical detachment of someone discussing weather patterns rather than destroying lives. "Either way, Mitchell Medical Supplies ceases to exist. The only question is whether your mother dies comfortably in a private room or in a crowded ward where the nurses are overworked and the equipment is outdated." The trap was perfect because Emma had left him no real choice, but David's pride made him ask the question burning in his chest. "What about Jessica? What about my daughter?" Something flickered in Emma's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or the ghost of the woman who'd once wanted children so desperately that she'd endured years of invasive treatments and monthly disappointments. "Your daughter is innocent," she said finally, "and I'm not a monster. The house is paid off. I bought the mortgage 6 months ago through another shell company, and I'll transfer it to Jessica's name. Your child will have a home, but you'll have nothing else except the knowledge that you destroyed your life by valuing the wrong things. David signed the papers 3 days later in a conference room that smelled like lemon polish and regret, but his hands shook so badly that the signature looked like a child's scrawl. Emma didn't attend the signing, sending her lawyers instead. But David felt her presence in every clause that stripped away his identity and his future. His mother died 2 weeks later, comfortable and pain-free in a private room, with round-the-clock nursing care that Emma had authorized. But David couldn't decide if that mercy made the revenge crueler or kinder. The funeral was small, but Jessica didn't attend because she'd left him the day after learning about the bankruptcy, taking their 6-month-old daughter to live with her parents in another state. "You lied to me," Jessica had said, her pretty face twisted with anger and disappointment. "You told me you were successful, but you were broke the whole time we were together. I didn't sign up to raise a baby in poverty." David had wanted to explain that Emma had orchestrated his downfall, but the words had stuck in his throat because the real truth was worse. He'd orchestrated his own destruction the moment he'd decided his wife's worth was measured in fertility rather than capability, love, or partnership. 6 months after losing everything, David worked at a medical supply warehouse loading trucks for $12 an hour, but the job was something Emma had arranged through connections he didn't understand. The manager had hired him despite his lack of references and had even advanced him money for a security deposit on a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and defeat. He'd tried to see his daughter twice, but Jessica's lawyer had filed for full custody and child support that took most of his paycheck, leaving him barely enough for ramen noodles and regret. The irony wasn't lost on him that Jessica had been so eager to give him the child Emma couldn't, but that child had become another thing he'd lost through his own arrogance and blindness. The news reached him through a forwarded email that seemed designed to maximize his pain. Emma Hartley had been named Healthcare Innovator of the Year by the American Medical Association, but the article detailed her rise from research scientist to medical tycoon. There were photos of her cutting ribbons at new hospital wings and shaking hands with senators, and in every image she looked powerful and complete in ways that had nothing to do with motherhood or marriage. The article mentioned her brief marriage to a medical supply executive who failed to recognize her potential, but David knew he was more than unrecognizing. He'd been actively dismissive, treating her accomplishments as hobbies while building his identity around a company that had been surviving only through her secret support. "She could have been open about it," David muttered to his empty apartment, trying to kindle anger from the ashes of his humiliation. "She could have told me who she was." But even as he said it, he remembered the times she'd tried to share her excitement about a new patent or a successful licensing deal, and how he'd half listened while scrolling through his phone or thinking about sales projections that had never materialized. She had told him, but he'd been too self-important to hear her. The final twist came on a Tuesday, 1 year exactly from the day he'd signed the divorce papers that had set all of this in motion. David received a package at the warehouse with no return address, but inside was a thumb drive and a note in Emma's precise handwriting. "You destroyed our marriage by blaming me for circumstances neither of us could control, but you never knew the full story. Perhaps it's time you learned what you threw away." The thumb drive contained medical records that David initially didn't understand, but as he read through them on the warehouse computer during his lunch break, the horror bloomed like poison in his chest. The infertility hadn't been Emma's problem. It had been his. A childhood case of mumps that his mother had mentioned casually years ago had left him with severely compromised sperm count. But Emma had discovered this fact early in their marriage and had never told him. Instead, She'd endured years of treatments and tests and monthly disappointments, letting him blame her while she quietly sought solutions that might have worked if he'd been willing to try IVF or adoption. But David had refused those options, calling them unnatural and insisting that real men don't need science to have children. The medical records included a notation from a fertility specialist. Patient's husband shows classic narcissistic patterns and unwillingness to accept male factor diagnosis. Patient has requested we attribute infertility to unexplained causes to preserve marital harmony. Emma had protected his ego at the cost of her own reputation and emotional well-being, but he'd repaid that sacrifice by divorcing her for a woman who'd gotten pregnant almost certainly by someone else. David now realized with sick certainty. Jessica's timeline had never quite added up, but he'd been too flattered by her pregnancy to question whose child she actually carried. The package included one more item, a check for $50,000 and another note. This covers 1 year of child support for your daughter because she deserves a father who can afford to see her. Don't thank me. Use it to become someone worthy of being her father. David cashed the check with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, but he didn't use the money the way Emma probably expected. Instead, he hired a lawyer and a private investigator, and within 3 months, he had proof that his daughter wasn't biologically his. Jessica had been sleeping with her regional manager the entire time she'd been dating David. The paternity test results freed him from child support, but also from the one thing that had given his destruction meaning, and David found himself sitting in his car outside St. Augustine Memorial, watching the lights in Emma's top-floor office and trying to understand why she'd given him money to support a child that wasn't even his. "Because she's a better person than you ever were," he said to his reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in 2 years, he was completely honest with himself about what he'd lost and why. The final note came another 6 months later, delivered to his new apartment, a better place that David could afford, because he'd been promoted to warehouse manager and had been saving every penny beyond basic survival. The note contained just 3 sentences in Emma's handwriting. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger is exhausting. Live a better life than you did with me. And David, consider therapy. You need it more than you need revenge or redemption." David did get therapy, and over the course of 2 years, he slowly built something resembling a life that had value beyond status and legacy. He never saw Emma again except in occasional news articles about her expanding healthcare empire. But he kept that final note in his wallet as a reminder of the extraordinary woman he'd been too ordinary to appreciate. The brutal revenge had left him bankrupt and regretful, but Emma's final mercy had given him something he'd never expected, a chance to become someone different, someone better, someone who measured worth in character rather than fertility or finance. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined when he'd signed those divorce papers, but perhaps it was the ending he deserved. And somewhere in a hospital tower, overlooking the city, Emma Hartley continued building her empire, childless but never empty, powerful and complete in ways David was only beginning to understand that true strength required. The charity gala at St. Augustine Memorial's new pediatric wing sparkled with champagne and designer gowns, but Emma Hartley moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of someone who'd long ago stopped trying to impress anyone. At 42, she'd added 4 more hospitals to her empire and had been profiled in Forbes as one of the nation's most influential healthcare executives. But the achievement that made her smile tonight was the Children's Cancer Research Center that bore her mother's name. "Dr. Hartley, the ribbon cutting is in 10 minutes, her assistant murmured, but Emma was already moving toward the new wing's entrance where photographers had gathered like well-dressed vultures. What she didn't expect was to see David Mitchell among the crowd of donors and supporters, though he looked so different from the man she'd divorced that she almost didn't recognize him. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by a simple but well-tailored blazer, but more significantly, the arrogance that had once defined his posture had been replaced by something quieter, humility perhaps, or simply the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Their eyes met across the lobby, but Emma didn't look away because she'd stopped running from her past the moment she'd decided to weaponize it. David approached slowly, as if afraid she might summon security, but his hands were empty, except for a small envelope that looked worn from being carried too long. "I wasn't sure you'd want me here," David said, his voice lacking the confidence that had once irritated her with its unfounded certainty. "But I've been volunteering in the pediatric ward for the past year, and I wanted to see this moment." Emma's eyebrows rose slightly because this information hadn't reached her, though she made a mental note to ask her volunteer coordinator why a man named David Mitchell had slipped through without triggering the alerts she'd placed on his name years ago. "Volunteering? Reading to kids during their chemotherapy sessions," David explained, and there was something raw in his expression that suggested this wasn't performance, but genuine purpose. "My therapist suggested I find a way to give back that wasn't about my ego or my redemption, but about just showing up for people who needed someone to care." The admission was so far removed from the man Emma had married that she felt a strange vertigo, but she gestured for him to walk with her toward a quieter corner of the lobby. "And have you found redemption, I mean?" "I've found something better than redemption," David said, handing her the worn envelope. "I've found accountability and a life that has meaning beyond what it gives back to me. That envelope contains the last thing I owe you, the truth about what your revenge actually did." Emma opened the envelope with careful fingers, but inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter written in David's handwriting, though the penmanship was steadier than she remembered. "Dear Emma, you broke me and I deserved to be broken. But what you did after breaking me was give me the pieces and the space to rebuild into something that wasn't built on arrogance, entitlement, or the belief that my worth came from things I possessed rather than who I was. I spent 3 years in therapy learning that my narcissism wasn't just about you or our marriage. It was a pattern that destroyed everything I touched because I couldn't see value in anything that didn't reflect my own ego back at me. Jessica wasn't my victim. She was a mirror showing me that I chose relationships based on what they gave me rather than what I could give. The bankruptcy forced me to start over with nothing, but nothing turned out to be the best teacher I ever had. I learned to load trucks with dignity, to accept help without resentment, to measure my days in kindness rather than accomplishments. But here's the truth you never knew. Discovering that the infertility was mine, not yours, didn't just destroy my ego. It freed me from the lie I'd been living that biology determined worth. I spent years blaming you for not giving me children, but I never once asked if you wanted them for yourself, or if you wanted them because I demanded them. I met someone 2 years ago, a woman who can't have children due to cancer treatment in her 20s, and when she told me this on our 3rd date, I told her it didn't matter because I'd learned the hard way that family has nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with showing up. We got married last month in a small ceremony, and we're fostering 2 children who needed a home more than we needed biological legacy. I'm not writing this to ask for your forgiveness, because you already gave me that, and I'm still learning to accept it. I'm writing to tell you that your revenge worked better than you probably intended. It didn't just bankrupt me financially, it bankrupted the person I was and forced me to build someone new from the ground up. You were right about everything, Emma. I was the problem. I was the broken one. and I threw away the best thing in my life because I couldn't see past my own reflection. Thank you for destroying me. It was the greatest gift you could have given, even if it took me years to understand that." Emma folded the letter carefully, but her throat felt tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. "You're fostering," she said finally, looking up at David with eyes that held something other than the cold satisfaction she'd felt 5 years ago. "2 boys, ages 6 and 8, David confirmed, pulling out his phone to show her a photo of himself with 2 smiling children at a park. Marcus has ADHD and a history of abandonment issues, and Tyler is on the autism spectrum and barely spoke when he came to us. But they're ours now, and watching my wife love them without biology mattering has taught me more about real parenthood than I learned in all my years of demanding biological children." The irony wasn't lost on Emma. David had finally become a father, but only after learning that fatherhood had nothing to do with the fertility he'd once prized above everything else. "And your wife knows? About our marriage? About what happened?" "She knows everything," David said quietly. "I don't keep secrets anymore because secrets were how I justified my worst behavior. She knows I was a terrible husband to you, that I blamed you for my own shortcomings, and that you had every right to destroy me the way you did." The ribbon cutting happened with the usual ceremony and speeches, but Emma found herself distracted by the sight of David in the pediatric ward afterward, reading "Where the Wild Things Are" to a small girl with no hair and eyes too old for her 7 years. His voice was gentle but engaging, and the child laughed at his monster impressions in a way that suggested this wasn't his first time visiting her. "That's Sophia," a nurse said, appearing at Emma's elbow with a chart. "She's been here for 6 months with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Mr. Mitchell comes 3 times a week, and she always perks up when she knows he's coming. Says he's her story dad." Emma watched for a moment longer, but her mind was processing the disconnect between the man she'd married and the man reading to a dying child with no agenda except to make her smile. "How's her prognosis?" "Good, actually," the nurse said with genuine warmth. "She's responding well to treatment, and her family is optimistic about remission. But Mr. Mitchell still comes, even though he knows she'll probably recover and won't need him anymore. That's how you know it's real, when someone keeps showing up even after they're no longer needed." The observation struck Emma with unexpected force, because David had never shown up for her in the ways that mattered. But here he was, showing up for strangers with a consistency that suggested fundamental change rather than performance. They met again in the hospital cafeteria an hour later, both carrying coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime last week, but the awkwardness between them had softened into something approaching comfortable silence. "I don't expect anything from you," David said finally, stirring sugar into his coffee with focused concentration. "I'm not here looking for absolution or friendship or anything that would make this easier for me. I just wanted you to know that the woman you destroyed wasn't who I was supposed to be, and the man I'm becoming is grateful you cared enough to force that change." Emma studied him over the rim of her cup, searching for traces of manipulation or ulterior motive, but all she found was exhaustion mixed with quiet determination. "Do you hate me for what I did?" "I spent 2 years hating you," David admitted. "And then I spent another year hating myself for hating you when you'd only given me exactly what I deserved. But hate is just anger with nowhere to go, and my therapist helped me understand that I was angry at you for holding up a mirror I couldn't avoid. And now? Now I'm grateful," David said simply. "Not in a masochistic way, but in the way you're grateful for a surgeon who removed a tumor even though the surgery hurt like hell. You cut out the worst parts of me, Emma, and yeah, it nearly killed me, but I'm healthier now than I was when I was married to you and lying to myself about who I was. The honesty was almost painful in its directness, but Emma found herself respecting this version of David in ways she'd never respected the man she'd married. "I wanted to hurt you," she confessed, her own honesty surprising her. "I wanted you to feel every bit of pain you'd caused me, magnified and concentrated until you understood what you'd done." "Mission accomplished," David said with a slight smile that held no bitterness. "But somewhere in the revenge, you also gave me a roadmap out, even if you didn't mean to. The money for child support, the job at the warehouse, the medical records, each thing was a piece of truth I needed to face. You could have just destroyed me and walked away, but you kept leaving breadcrumbs that led me toward becoming better." Emma hadn't thought about it that way, but looking back, she could see the pattern. Each calculated move had been both punishment and potential salvation, destruction mixed with the tools for reconstruction. "Maybe I'm not as cruel as I thought I was," she said quietly. "Or maybe you're exactly as cruel as you needed to be," David countered, but with enough residual love to make sure the cruelty served a purpose beyond just causing pain. They talked for another hour, but the conversation stayed in safe territory. David's foster children and their progress, Emma's plans to expand into rural health care, the strange healing that comes from accepting that some relationships end badly, but don't have to end in permanent mutual destruction. "I should go," David said finally, checking his watch with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that being late was a form of disrespect. "I'm picking up the boys from school, and Marcus has anxiety when we're not on time." "David," Emma called as he stood to leave, surprising herself with the impulse. "The volunteer coordinator position in the pediatric wing is opening up next month. It's a paid position, and it would involve coordinating all the reading programs and family support services. If you're interested, I'll make sure your application gets a fair review." The offer hung between them like a bridge neither had expected, but David's eyes widened with something that looked like hope mixed with disbelief. "You'd hire me? After everything?" "I'd hire the person you've become," Emma corrected. "The person you were wouldn't have lasted a week in that position, because it requires empathy, consistency, and the ability to show up for people who can't give you anything in return. But the man who reads to Sophia 3 times a week and fosters children who need stability, that man would be excellent at the job." "I don't deserve this," David said, but his voice cracked slightly. "Probably not," Emma agreed, "but those kids deserve someone who understands that showing up is the whole job, and you seem to have finally learned that lesson. Send me your resume, and we'll go from there." 6 months later, Emma stood in her office reviewing quarterly reports, but her attention kept drifting to the email from the pediatric wing director, praising the new volunteer coordinators, innovative programs, and genuine rapport with families. David had transformed the department with support groups for parents, extended reading hours, and a foster family mentorship program that connected current foster parents with families in crisis. "He's the best hire we've made in years," the director had written. "Completely lacks ego, shows up early, stays late, and the kids adore him. Whatever happened in his past, he's clearly learned from it." Emma saved the email in a folder she'd never admit to keeping, but seeing David succeed at something that had nothing to do with his own advancement gave her a satisfaction that felt different from the cold triumph of revenge. This was something warmer, more complex. The recognition that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction but transformation, giving someone the tools to become better than they were, even if they'd hurt you unforgivably. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for the chance. I won't waste it. D." Emma typed a response, deleted it, typed another, but finally settled on something simple. "I know, that's why I gave it to you." She didn't expect friendship with David. Some wounds were too deep for that kind of healing. But she'd discovered something more valuable than friendship. The knowledge that her revenge had been powerful enough to break a man, but precise enough to leave him the pieces he needed to rebuild into something better. The legendary medical tycoon stood at her window overlooking the city, childless but surrounded by purpose, powerful but no longer driven by pain, and for the first time since signing those divorce papers 7 years ago, Emma Hartley felt something close to peace. David Mitchell had taken everything from her that biology could offer, but she'd taken everything from him that arrogance had built. And in the ashes of that mutual destruction, they'd both found versions of themselves that were somehow more complete than what they'd been together. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it wasn't hatred either. It was something new, the recognition that revenge, when done with surgical precision, could be both devastation and gift, ending and beginning, the closing of one story and the opening of another. And in the pediatric wing 3 floors below, David read Charlotte's Web to a room full of children who didn't care about his past mistakes, only that he showed up and made the scary hospital feel a little less frightening, which was perhaps the only redemption that mattered.